So you can run the UCS blade in there, and then of course install the FirePOWER services software there. So one of the beauties for this is that you can actually, of course, save money by freeing up, valuable, square footage within a data center or in your environment, right? So you don't have to actually put yet another box. It can actually run in the Cisco ISR routers, and the footprint will be a lot more lightweight.
That's Omar Santos, Principal Engineer in the Cisco Product Security Incident Response Team within Cisco's Security Research and Operations. A graduate of Harvard University, Omar mentors and leads engineers and incident response managers during the investigation and resolution of security vulnerabilities in all Cisco products, including cloud services. In this presentation hosted by Omar, he provides a comprehensive overview of the FirePOWER services that Cisco has recently developed. As a rising technology within IT, the Cisco FirePOWER Next Generation Firewall is the industry's first fully integrated threat-focused next-gen firewall with unified management. It uniquely provides advanced threat protection before, during, and after attacks. Omar will discuss the different aspects of the FirePOWER services, as well as various deployment options listing different Cisco Adaptive Security Appliances, or ASA, and FirePOWER models, and much more in this episode presented by the Cisco Learning Network. Omar moves next to a slide with a funny little cartoon of a person's confused expression. The text on the slide reads FirePOWER or FirePOWER, with power in the second word capitalized.
So now, the first thing that you're probably going to ask is it FirePOWER with lowercase, as you're actually seeing here, right? Or if it's FirePOWER with uppercase, as you see in the second example. And this is actually a question that I have all the time from folks, because in the documentation at Cisco, we actually have that mixed match, right? So you see in some cases FirePOWER with lowercase and FirePOWER with uppercase. Now, the short answer to that is that every time that you see FirePOWER with an uppercase, that refers to the FirePOWER services running in the ASA, right? So for the most part, you're actually going to see these for the classic FirePOWER services in the ASA, and then the lowercase is we refer to as the FirePOWER services running in any type of platform, and also the nomenclature for the term other platforms like the FirePOWER management console, right? So I just wanted to start with that to clarify some of the nomenclature that actually now have.
Omar's next slide is titled Integrated Threat Defense Across the Attack Continuum and displays 3 gears in the middle of the slide with an arrow passing between them. They are all joined within a zone labeled Attack Continuum. The first gear is labeled before, the second gear is labeled during, and the last gear is after. Underneath the gear labeled before, the terms firewall/VPN, granular app control, and modem threat control are listed. There is also the description of the gear to control, enforce, and harden. Underneath the gear labeled during, the terms NGIPS, security intelligence, and web security are listed, and the description reads detect, block, and defend. And under the final gear labeled after, advanced malware protection, retrospective security, and IOCS/incident response are listed. The description of the final gear reads scope, contain, and remediate. All of these terms are above a banner labeled visibility and automation.
This is actually what we call the attack continuum, right? What is important from this slide is that, what is important from this concept is that there's no network or system that is 100% immune to a cyber attack or to a breach, and we all know this, right? So we all know, are security practitioners, and this is why we have to have an integrated threat defense to control, enforce, and also harden the network, in a proactive fashion before an intrusion, right? So before an attack actually takes place, we also need to detect, block, and defend whenever an attack is actually, taking place, right? So not only before the attack materializes, but also if an attack actually is ongoing or if a breach is actually ongoing, the ability to detect, block, and defend, our infrastructure, right? And now, again, like I mentioned, there's no network or system that is immune for this, and there may be cases on where, a breach actually has materialized. So for that, we have to have the proper mechanisms that after the attack takes place, to scope, contain, and remediate that, right? So what we actually have done in here is we have outlined some of the technologies that are particular into each of the, phases of the attack continuum, right? So again, this is what we call the attack continuum. So, in the case of, the traditional firewalls and VPNs, you typically see them as a control, enforcing, and hardening. But now with the next generation firewall, right? So NGFW, and we actually have a threat-centric, solution that goes over the whole attack continuum, because we now have, of course, the traditional firewall capabilities, granular application control, and some other modern threat controls, but we also now have the ability to integrate security intelligence and other things like the next generation IPS capabilities that we have from SourceFire, which was an acquisition that Cisco made a couple of years ago, and we also have integrated the advanced malware protection to be able to not only detect, block, and defend, but also to do retrospective analysis and retrospective security when an attack actually takes place, and then contain that attack and remediate it successfully. So again, you may be already familiar with this, but I wanted to take a moment to explain what the attack continuum is.
Omar moves next to a slide that is titled Cisco ASA and FirePOWER NGFWs, or Next Generation Firewalls. The slide points out that this is the world's most widely deployed enterprise-class ASA stateful firewall and has industry-leading FirePOWER Next Generation IPS, or NG-IPS.
Now, again, some of you may be already familiar with the Cisco ASA, the traditional Cisco ASA. What we actually have done, in the several, last few months, is that we have integrated a lot of the capabilities from SourceFire, from the next generation IPS, along with things like reputation and category-based URL filtering, by actually, and other things like the enterprise class granular application visibility and control, or what we call AVC, and where we actually have now a complete end-to-end solution, or complete solution that we can actually help you to defend your network, and also contain any attacks actually that will take place, right? So now we support this FirePOWER next generation firewall software in the Cisco ASA, and also in some platforms that I'm actually going to cover in a minute.
Omar's next slide shows the Cisco next generation firewall platforms in 3 different categories. The first category shows that the devices portrayed within it have the capability of between 250 megabyte and 1.75 gigabyte max AVC throughput. The devices are labeled as being FirePOWER Threat Defense for ASA 5500X. The second category shows the FirePOWER in capital letters services on ASA 5500X and 5586X as being 4.5 to 15 gigabyte max AVC throughput. And the final category of devices shows the FirePOWER 4100 series and the FirePOWER 9300. The 4100 series is listed as being between 12 and 25 gigabytes, and the 9300 is listed as being between 25 and 100 gigabytes.
So again, in the Cisco ASA, we have the 2 things. That we have the FirePOWER services, and I'm going to start from the middle here. So we have the FirePOWER services with uppercase, which is the traditional FirePOWER services running whether it's in a module, in the case of the 5585, or in an SSD, in the case of the 5500X, right? So 5506, 5508, 5516, and so forth. Now, in the 5500X, that software can actually run in that SSD, and the traditional ASA software, still runs as a separate entity. Now, what we have actually recently integrated is a single image, right? That's what we call the FirePOWER Threat Defense, or FTD for short. And basically, that's a combined image of the ASA capabilities and the FirePOWER services, and you actually run it, just as one image in the device, and so everything is actually integrated. And I'll cover, how actually this works out. What are the different features that are supported, and how if you actually might want to migrate to that, how will you do that, later in this presentation. Now, the other thing that we also have is we added a couple of, or a series of appliances within the last couple of months too. The first ones are the FirePOWER 4100 series appliance. Those are the next generation firewalls. We actually announced them, earlier this calendar year. And we also have the, enterprise and service provider class appliance called the FirePOWER 9300. In that case, this is actually a picture of it. In that case, you can run the FirePOWER Threat Defense software in one of the modules. You can also run traditional ASA software if you want to, and you can also run a Radware's software for anti-DDoS, or DDoS protection, or denial of service protection. All these platforms are actually managed by the FirePOWER Management Center, and I'm also going to go over a new offering that Cisco has that is called the Cisco Defense Orchestrator, or CDO for short, later in the presentation. Moving along, there's also virtual platforms, for this environment. We have the virtual ASA that can not only be deployed in a VMware or vSphere type environment or Hyper-V, but also it can be deployed in, Amazon Web Services. We actually have an image for that, as Microsoft Azure, Hyper-V, like I mentioned, and of course we have support for KVM as well. Right, so this is a traditional ASA. For the FirePOWER next generation IPS, so again, we can deploy it in a vSphere and also in ISR. And I'm going to cover, the ISR support in a few minutes later in the presentation. So now the FirePOWER next generation firewall virtual, that is supported in vSphere, so again in the VMware environment, AWS and KVM. Now the next generation features within FTD, includes many things like I mentioned before. We went over, I briefly mentioned some of the URL and DNS, protection. I'm going to go over of what is actually DNS sync calling, but that's actually something that we now support in the next generation platforms. We also have, of course, the Cisco application visibility and control, like I mentioned before, but we also have introduced the support of OpenAppID, which is actually an open source application detection language or mechanism that for application enumeration. Also, like we know, already, we include or we integrate the IPS and IDS capabilities of Snort, traditional Snort. We also have integrated not only AMP, but also ThreatGrid capabilities. And ThreatGrid was an acquisition that Cisco made a few months ago, and we're actually maybe a little bit more than a year now. Time flies, but it's an acquisition where we have the capabilities of actually doing sandboxing and dynamic analysis of malware, either on-premise, so locally, or actually in the cloud. So that integration of not only the advanced malware protection capabilities that we had with SourceFire, but also the sandbox and dynamic analysis that we have with ThreatGrid, which is actually now a complete integration, is also a capability of the FirePOWER Threat Defense software. And then, of course, we also have a huge footprint within Cisco as far as actually security intelligence. And one of the teams that you may have already heard of is the Talos organization within Cisco, which basically is, it's basically a collection of teams, but it's a team that dedicates that is dedicated to do security research and then keep on top of all the different threats. And as you probably have seen either in the news or in Cisco security blogs and everything, they are constantly actually finding new ways how bad actors actually are doing their malfeasance, and how things are actually being compromised nowadays. They do a lot of research, and you probably have seen some of their posts related to ransomware recently. So again, we actually have a huge footprint within Cisco as far as actually talent and capabilities that allows us to actually have a complete security intelligence that we can feed into to products and services like the FirePOWER next generation services.
To see the entirety of Omar Santos' presentation on Introduction to FirePOWER Services and Next Generation Firewalls, including an in-depth demonstration and further deep dive reviews of migration upgrade approaches and techniques, be sure to visit the Cisco Learning Network, where you will find even more training videos that lay your foundation for next generation firewall training. Please subscribe to the Cisco Learning Network podcast, and be sure to leave us a review on iTunes if you found this helpful. Thanks for listening.